Welcome everyone to today's webcast. We're going to get started in just about 2 minutes, so hang tight. Once again, welcome everyone. We'll be getting started in just about 1 minute with today's webcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, Monitoring Employees in a Remote Workplace. I'm your host, Nick Cavalanci with Tech Evangelism. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. The session is being recorded today, and a link will be sent out to you after the webcast in case you want to be able to review this webcast and offer to your friends, your colleagues, etc. There is a Q&A box over on the right. I'm going to encourage you to make sure that you participate in today's webcast. We're really looking forward to a very interactive, discussion-oriented webcast, so make sure you use that Q&A box to put both your questions, any comments you have. We're going to try and involve you as much as we can in the webinar, and I think that's probably about it. And so without further ado, let me kind of jump in and get started. I think the concept of allowing employees to work remotely, of course, brings some organizational benefits with it. I'm believing that you do as well. You get happier workers, enhanced productivity in some cases, lower overhead costs, and of course an ability to execute without the sort of the constraints of geography. You know, everyone has to live in South Florida, like where I happen to be. But with this workers' paradise, as it were, there comes the potential for misuse of company time and company resources. That makes it necessary for the organization to kind of be watchful of just how employees utilize both of those things. And so the question kind of becomes sort of why, what, and how should you measure, in some cases, let's say remote employee productivity. And then maybe there's a second question maybe I'll add that sort of broadens the scope as well and broadens the topic to sort of why, what, and how should you be monitoring for even insider threats, because even productivity is somewhat a threat to the organization's bottom line. And so in today's webcast, I'm joined by Patrick Knight. He's Veriato's Senior Director of Cyber Strategy. Hey, Patrick, thanks for joining me today. I'm looking forward to a great conversation with you.
Hey, Nick, thanks for having me.
Glad you're here. And so Patrick and I are going to dive into this topic and have a conversation around sort of, I'm going to say, I guess, the why, what, and how to monitor remote employees. Now, the format's a little different than what maybe you're normally used to. Usually it's death by PowerPoint. You know, you guys have been in one of those before, 58 slides in an hour. You know, you're like, stop. We're not doing that. I think we have a total of about 6 or 7 slides. They're mostly there as a visual indicator of what we're talking about. This is very much a discussion format more than anything. And so if you want to participate in on that conversation, again, use the Q&A box. Make sure that you're in on the conversation by providing some commentary. I'll be watching that throughout as we're having this discussion here today. And so make sure that you do that. And then if you have a particular question we just don't get to towards the end, we will have a bit of a Q&A time at the end. And then for some reason, if we don't get your question at all, someone from Veriato will definitely reach out to you after the webcast to make sure that that question gets answered. So let's start with the topic of why even monitor remote employees in the first place. Now, having employees that are remote, I believe, and from my own experience in IT for 25 years, it does create a couple of sort of senses of different things for the employee themselves. They get this sort of sense of empowerment, meaning they can do sort of, obviously they can get a lot of work done. They're trusted by the organization. They can kind of get what they want to get done when they want to get it done, and don't necessarily work the same number of hours, like 9 to 5, as we would if you were sort of a butt in a seat inside of a bricks and mortar building and that kind of thing. But I also think it also creates kind of a sense of entitlement where I don't need to do as much, or I've put in a really solid, I've actually heard an employee say, I put in a really solid 6 hours today. So you're supposed to be working 8 hours, if not more, today. But there's this sort of sense of entitlement that comes in play. Patrick, just pulling in on the conversation, sort of what else do you think happens when you take an employee and you allow them to work remotely?
Well, I agree with what you said about the freedom and the empowerment. There can also be some other side effects that typically might occur with someone who is remote, meaning maybe they start feeling disconnected, and that could bring down their productivity. So they may have this probably another form of entitlement might be this feeling of what's mine is mine. I'm in my home office. I've created this content or this product, and so there may be the sort of psychological impact of forgetting who you work for and that you're doing this on behalf of an employer. So there's both good and bad. I agree with the positive. The workforce is moving more and more out of necessity and fortunately out of convenience to allowing more employees to work remotely. I agree with everything you said. It allows organizations to expand their talent base in ways that if you're completely restricted to a geographic region, then you're limited to only the options in that area. Allowing the flexibility of remote workers allows organizations to expand their talent and possibly get even greater talent they might otherwise be or might otherwise attain. Uh, I think of remote employees in a variety of models. So the remote employee might be someone who's permanently remote. A remote employee might be someone who's traveling or just working from a coffee house for the afternoon. So there's different models, and different models are going to be viewed differently by different organizations. It's going to vary greatly on the size of your company, what your needs are, and what your mission is. For example, I would imagine that a very large financial organization might think differently about this, but uh, the economy is such that organizations, startups of a variety of industries wouldn't be able to grow sufficiently if they don't adopt and allow a certain amount of remote employee work options.
I like the fact that you brought up the coffee house. Because it sort of lends to a couple other things that you talked about, which is the employee being remote also creates some sense of concerns for the organization. And you brought up a little bit of engagement, like they're out of sight, out of mind. And that can create that sense of entitlement. If you guys in the audience are familiar with the fraud triangle, it's motivation, opportunity, and rationalization. And motivation is usually like my significant other suddenly has cancer, I need money, or I have a gambling debt, or whatever. Opportunity is I'm remote, no one knows what I'm doing. Perfect. And then rationalization is that thing that Patrick's talking about, where people are disconnected, and I did all this work and I built all this, so why do I have to do it for them? And now you're rationalizing away. No. You have an obligation to the organization, kind of thing. So there's an issue there. There, of course, the issue of employee productivity. We're going to spend a good amount of time talking about that today. And then that issue of the coffee shop you brought back is this issue of organizational security. If you guys in the audience are ever paying attention to any of the stories in the news, you know that it's very easy for someone, for example, to set up a fake Wi-Fi hotspot, someplace, somebody connects to it for free, and now you've got a remote employee that's not putting the organization at risk because they're surfing the web, passing up maybe credit card details, log-on credentials, whatever the case is. It certainly puts the organization at risk, and all of these things do. Patrick, thoughts on the risk there that this is creating?
Yeah, actually, I would add to that the first bullet that working remotely could create a sense of lax security. You might think of your home office as, well, no one's going to target me here, or sitting in a coffee shop, no one's going to look over my shoulder or eavesdrop, or it's actually not even that basic anymore. I mean, headline after headline with how trivial it is to set up rogue hotspots, and the technology that's available now to in public places eavesdrop on wireless or Bluetooth devices, for example. There's so many threats and so many threat factors that working remotely could, if the employee is not uber security minded and uber security aware of all the different risks, then once you walk out the doors of the fortress that is your company headquarters into any public spot or self-produced office, then now you've potentially opened up a great amount of risk to the data or to the information that you hold on behalf of your employer. So there's a tremendous topic here alone just on all the different attack vectors beyond just productivity as well.
No, totally agreed. So for you guys in the audience, we're going to cover a couple of slides around productivity and then try to dive a little bit into maybe an overarching sort of topic around security itself. But we're going to use productivity as sort of the basis for a good portion of this. So, but I know Patrick and I both love the security topic, and so we always like to run home to mama and and talk about it whenever we get together. So, but we're going to talk a little bit about productivity, and then we'll talk a little bit about security as well. On the topic of why measure productivity in the first place, because some of you are probably very concerned about security, but you're not thinking about productivity as a threat to the organization, and it really is. And so what I'd like to do is, Patrick, I've got a couple of bullets here. I'm going to cover all the bullets on this slide, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about this and get your input on this. There was a stat for you guys in the audience. This is from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this is a culmination of data from 2013 to 2017. It was an American time use survey, so this is a U.S. survey, and they found that employees spend almost all of their time doing their job, right? 92.3%. They might go, well, Nick, if they're doing their job, why are we even talking about this? Can we just skip to the security part? Well, hold on. Because I want to talk about that. Let's call it, whatever it is, 7.7% that's left or whatnot, and so the idea is there is a period of time that's unproductive. Also, by the way, I think it's reasonable to make an assumption, and I'm hoping you guys would say that as well. When I say this is that when people say, oh, I spend all my time working in my job, they really don't. Come on. I mean, we all kind of give. I know I work from home, and there are times in my day where I sit down and I think I took a 5-minute break and I took a 25-minute break, or whatever. It happens. But they think they're doing 92.3%. So this translates into about 3 hours a week of time. Now,
Hey everyone, we seem to have lost our presenter. Just give us a few minutes while we try to figure that problem out.
I said, we're doing just fine. But you look at the bottom, you're paying 7.5 people to do nothing. That's material. So, Patrick, are you seeing this with the Veriato customers as well? You're seeing this same kind of issue around productivity, and what else would you add to this conversation here?
Well, this is a great topic. I just want to bring to your attention that we had a temporary dropout, but I think we understand from what we heard and once you came back in. So what are we hearing? This is a great topic because at Veriato, we have customers on the entire spectrum of size, very large enterprises down to very small and medium-sized companies. And it's anecdotal, or we hear regularly from our customers, it seems that the priority for the larger businesses is more into data theft and IP theft. When you get down into the medium and small size companies, they're really uber concerned about productivity, more so than loss of information. Why? Because if you think of a small, medium-sized business, one employee and their salary is probably substantial. And if you factor in all the benefits that any employee gets with their health care, with their insurance, and so forth, every employee comes at a higher cost value to the company than just the take-home salary. If that one individual is unproductive. And I don't mean just for a day, but I mean, typically they're concerned with repetition. Everyone's going to have a bad day. But if we're seeing a pattern that Patrick is just not doing his job, then that can be an enormous drain financially for one company. Think about the bonuses that might be paid out and how all the resources being paid into Patrick for him to do little to nothing, not meet his goals, spending the time that he could be doing, helping the entire organization meet their goals. That one person can create a drain. Now, what if it's just one? What if it's two people? I mean, that's an enormous problem, especially the smaller you are. If you have a tight deadlines, tight goals, tight financial situation. So there's a deep interest in organizations to make sure that they are inspiring their employees to be productive and to identify if they have someone who's not, and then to identify why. And so that's where technologies like what we're discussing today can help, because you said very aptly at the beginning of this discussion that productivity or low productivity really is a risk to small and medium-sized businesses in particular. So, and I personally am curious to get behind some of these numbers and figure out how the Department of Labor did these surveys. A lot of employers are probably going to want to say, yeah, my employees are productive. Or if you're actually surveying the employees themselves, well, of course they're going to say yes. How do you actually measure that? Are they actually using some sort of time management or user behavior analytics or user activity monitoring technology to verify that it's really 92.3% of the time?
What's interesting about this number, though, Patrick,
is much less.
I looked at, I did some work a couple of years back for Veriato, looking at salary.com used to do a time survey. It was a wasted time at work survey they did every year for a number of years. And over, I think it was 3 years they had this survey running. The numbers actually jibe. I mean, I think I had calculated doing the same kind of 100-person company calculation. It might have been 6 employees or 8 employees. It was something, I mean, it circled around this number. So it's very interesting that I totally agree. You want to figure out how they actually get that number. But when salary.com asked the employees themselves, the number wasn't too far off. It was pretty close. So Sophia has got a comment here. She's saying if someone isn't meeting goals that are obviously easily monitored, and the only things you have key performance indicators, or you have to get so many leads in marketing and you didn't, those kind of things. And she's saying work is done or it's not, and you can obviously tell that by a competent manager. And I think the point she's trying to make is you could just tell that someone's not getting their work done. I think, Sophia, the point that we're trying to make also is trying to figure out why they're not able to meet their goals. They just say, well, I worked really hard, and but it could be they're just like that person I mentioned. I did a solid 6 hours. And that's actually the problem. And then because obviously in the case of, if you, one of you guys in the audience, if you are the competent manager that Sophia is bringing up, you look bad because you're not hitting your numbers and you're trying to figure out why. And so that's kind of, I think, part of why this discussion comes in play. Patrick, any other thoughts?
No, but I was looking at again at the bullets here, and how does this scale in a 100-person company? The larger the organization now, the productivity measures may become more difficult to monitor, and there again lies a need for a technology to help with that. And again, consider scaling that. Keep adding zeros to that number. You're now looking for a needle in a haystack. So these all, no matter how large your organization is, productivity can be a drain if you have a couple of underperformers. And the larger the company, statistically, I would imagine you're going to have more underperformers. So what does that mean to catching it, to identifying why, seeing if it's remediable? Are they truly in need of being brought back into the organization as opposed to being let work remotely, given the topic of our discussion? So I typically look at remote employees through the prism of know your organization. What's the maturity of your organization? What's the maturity of the employee? It's possible you're not going to let a college student right out of who's just recently graduated work exclusively remotely. I think that's a privilege that a lot of organizations might feel need to be earned, or maybe you have to reach a particular seniority level. So there are a lot of factors you have to consider before even allowing that. So a lot of really interesting contexts to measuring what risk are you willing to entail as an organization when you let workers work remotely. I myself worked remotely for a number of years. Granted, I was not, it was not early in my career. It was after I'd attained a certain amount of seniority and responsibility, and I think my productivity was measured through my dialogue with my managers, through MBOs, if you use managed by objective style quarterly productivity measures. So there's a lot of factors into number one, just setting up who you're going to allow to work remotely, and then from there, okay, how do you enforce that? And I think you put it in a great scenario. I put in a solid 6 hours. That sense of entitlement can also come with seniority, and I think that can also backfire with some people. So hence the need for this discussion.
The only thing I'll add to that, and then I want to jump to the next slide, is your comment around either the 100-person company, then you go to the 1,000 and the 10,000-person company and so on. And obviously, you just keep adding zeros to the calculation here. But for those of you in the audience, you start thinking about the sort of value per employee as an organization adds on employees. Typically, the revenue starts kind of hockey sticking upward in terms of each employee. If you took the total revenue for the organization divided by the number of employees, each employee on the average is actually generating a ton more revenue for the organization. So the value to them is even more so, which is, I think, the point we're both trying to make here of why that whole needle in a haystack, and at the same time, gee, they're actually more valuable to the company here. Ricardo's asking, are we going to cover what tools or technology can monitor remote employees? We are, Ricardo. Don't worry, we're getting there, buddy. I promise. In fact, we're going to talk about some of that tactically on this next slide here. So I'm glad you're actually asking. You're asking at the right time, and let's kind of jump into that. So the question kind of becomes, what should you measure? Especially when it's around productivity. Again, we're going to talk about security in another slide or two, but what should you measure? And so I came up with 3 things, and Patrick, maybe you've got some other ones, and let's have a conversation about each of these here. The first one is just connectivity in the first place. How frequent is the employee actually connected to the corporate network, assuming that's part of their job. If they're purely remote, you're not going to be able to necessarily do connectivity. But thinking about connectivity, maybe thinking about application use. So that way you're monitoring to see how often are they utilizing, if let's say they're remotely doing accounts payable, they're inside the accounts payable application, utilizing the application, it's open, those kinds of things. And then the last one is even just application activity. There are solutions, going back to Ricardo's point of, hey, we're going to talk about what tools to use and monitor them. In some cases, you could have client-side applications like what Veriato offers, and in this case, they're actually watching what the employee does on their endpoint, on their workstation, and then measuring each of these kinds of things. Measuring to see, are you connected? What applications do you have? Are they in the foreground? Are you actively using them? Or are they just sitting in the background? Those kinds of things, and you get very tactical. Patrick, commentary on all this, and as well as what else did I miss?
Yeah, no, this is a great list. So I typically start this discussion with anyone on what have you communicated to your employee. You've got a good candidate, you've got a need that they want to fill, you're going to allow them to work remotely. What have you conveyed to them to say, here's the goals? Now, again, we've already listed several things that can happen in the psyche of anyone that's remote, whether they're disconnected or whether they decide I'm too senior to be held to these standards, or what, a lot of things could potentially happen. So setting the baseline up front over what the expectations are I'm a strong advocate of that. And then how do you measure it? So if you want to leverage a solution like what Veriato provides, our user activity monitoring and user behavior analytics technologies will be able to help organizations of any size look at all right, how long was Patrick online today? What was he doing? If he's a salesperson, was he using the right tools, or was he on Facebook? Was he on Facebook for 3 hours? And you mentioned the active time. If you're monitoring technology, it should be monitoring how long is Patrick active in any particular window or any particular application. It's not that I logged into my LinkedIn account. If it was in the background all day, then it's no issue. But if I'm spending active time on it all day, then maybe I'm wasting a little bit more time than I should be on my personal goals, rather than than helping the company. And so to the third point, application activity. Again, is the person, have I pulled up my Steam games that I've been playing? It's like, I don't understand why I'm not meeting my goals, but man, I've really scored high on whatever. There's a lot that can be happening for remote employees, and it may not matter whether it's a 9 to 5 time period. If you're allowing someone to work remotely, maybe the times are flexible, but can you tell what their habits are? And that's what this is about. Is are they habitually spending their time doing what they're being paid to do, or can we show through technology that they're claiming they're working 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day, but clearly they're spending excessive amounts of time doing other things. So these are all great points to consider when you're looking at what to monitor. But again, I would start every my personal opinion, I'm a strong advocate of starting every employee relationship with setting the guidelines on what you expect. And I think if everyone starts with that, then none of the rest of this should be a surprise. If the employer says, look, we set the goals up front and you're not meeting your goals, and we're also able to we see that you're spending time on stuff that is clearly not contributing to your goals. So this now gives the tools back to the employer to be able to say, all right, what can we do here to improve this, or is this the right scenario for this employee?
So let me answer Ricardo's question a little bit more deeply, because Ricardo, you're asking, well, what kind of tools should we be using? I'm sort of paraphrasing your question. On one hand, you've got tools like Veriatos. I'm going to kind of summarize it up by saying it's client side monitoring of behavior and activity, and then behind the scenes you have the things you would expect, reporting and alerting, and it's searching through the data and playback and so on. So you have that kind of a solution in place. Then other organizations may choose to do things like put a SIM solution together where they're going to go with logs, and they're going to basically double check, let's say, the web logs, any kind of log on activity. They take any kind of data sets that they can get together, and they'll utilize those pieces of information in sum total to try to build together, kind of a puzzle piece. Put all the puzzles together, all the pieces together, right, to come up with a puzzle, what it's going to look like, and say, this is what the employee did. And so there's those kinds of solutions as well. And then there are other kinds of solutions that are ones that purely record sessions, and then they utilize the session metadata. So they'll watch things like maybe application titles, or they'll sort of course, monitor when you log on and log off. And the places for each of these kind of depend also on the way that your employees interact with the organization. So, for example, if the employee is strictly utilizing their own laptop, I don't mean their own personal, but just their own laptop, they have a device at their home and working remotely, and they're not necessarily, let's say, connecting into some kind of like a Citrix session or a terminal services session, or remote desktop kind of a thing, then you probably want to have something that's client side, because you want to know what they're doing on that, because some of the work they're going to do has nothing to do with connecting to the office. They can connect right to Office 365. They connect right to Salesforce. They don't need to get to the office. So you need something that's client side for that. The logs aren't really going to work in that case either. But if they're, let's say, using remote desktops for everything, then you have an opportunity to say, well, they're going to be in their remote desktop doing their work. So that means they're technically on our network doing stuff. So now we could start maybe doing the SIM solution, or we could do the remote session monitoring, or whatever it is. You have other kinds of ways of doing it. So it kind of depends on how the employee works. Patrick, you agree, disagree? Other thoughts around the different kinds of technologies that are possible?
I do, and you hinted at a topic I had a great discussion about recently in a different forum regarding bring your own device type scenarios for employees, and it definitely overlapped with remote employees, and is the employer providing the devices or not? So I'm also a big advocate that employers should be providing those devices. That way, number one, there's all kinds of potential risks and liabilities with allowing just any device, particularly laptops, on the network of an employer, whether local or remote. But also it then gives the employer the flexibility to then deploy these types of technologies so they can be monitoring. It's on their devices. They provided it. All work done on it is done so at the behest of the employer. It's their data. So that's a really interesting topic on itself. I like to look back at my experiences when I was working remotely. Um, I wasn't just working remotely. I was sometimes there were a couple of years where my direct manager, a director, or a vice president was actually in another country, and so I've literally had myself literally on the opposite end of the globe, but I was completely using technologies they provided, and so they would have been at liberty to monitor all my activities. And similar to how our technology works, our technology can be deployed worldwide, and we're used in over 100 countries to monitor remote employees. And so a lot of really again, this is growing. The globe wouldn't the economies wouldn't be able to grow if it weren't for the fact that companies are moving more and more to this model.
Sorry, I had myself on mute there. Let's do this. Let's talk about how should you measure, because there's a bit of sort of a high level strategy that needs to be in place. Sophia mentioned here she's a cybersecurity researcher, and she actually made a question earlier, and she's talking about the potential for this to impact employee loyalty and escalate dissatisfaction, and that they lose people, and so you really have to be careful how you're going to do this. This also, by the way, isn't necessarily it should be a blanket for everybody, and people should be micromanaging everyone's time. This is more like if there are I always think of it this way, and the way that when I consult with organizations, I'm telling them they should be looking at even utilizing this for employee productivity in the same way they do any other insider threat. I consider productivity to be an insider threat, and the company has to have a certain tolerance for, someone might, they need a break and they got to do something other than, like, I know I worked in marketing for 10 years, and the folks in marketing, you can't be creative 100% of the time. Your brain will explode.
Right.
You need downtime. You've got to get away and do something else. And I in learning that over the time that I did in my own experience, I probably pissed some employees off in the beginning, because I sort of just did it as a way where I'm saying, oh no, you need to be work, and they can't. So we got to kind of figure out to make sure there's a way to measure properly. And so I want to kind of walk through some high level steps here, and Patrick, maybe we can talk about each one real quick. The first one here is you've got to create a baseline. And that baseline can be either for that individual employee, and or looking at a group of employees, like let's say all the salespeople, as the case might be, because one employee may not be indicative. People go through different phases. Maybe they have a different role for a period of time, work on a special project, whatever, but you want to create a baseline overall. So that's the first part here, is just establishing what does normal activity look like for the employee and or group as a whole. Patrick, what are you seeing customers doing? Is it mostly the individual? Is it the groups of people? Is it a mixture? What are you normally seeing?
Both, and this is speaking really to the crux of how user and entity behavior analytics works, and this is to monitor my activities over time and compare, am I significantly deviating from my patterns, and also comparing me to my peers. I might be in a specific group of similar employees, or depending on the industry, you might have different ways to break down your organization: financial, sales, engineering. And so you might compare one engineer with another engineer, but maybe not with the manager, but certainly with the hands-on guys, and so forth. So creating that baseline, it's a default feature in our technology to do both. You're not only monitoring Patrick against himself over time, but also has his productivity changed compared to his peers. Now, what if my productivity is through the roof? There's also positive intel right there that a lot of managers might want to know. How is it Patrick in sales is really just nailing it? Maybe we can tell by looking at what he's doing, where he's spending his time, and learn some things that we can share with his peers to bring them up. So there's sort of I don't always want people to think that there's a negative here, that employee monitoring is always about hitting someone over the head the moment they've stepped a line. I have not yet met a single customer of ours who are waiting for Patrick to step out of line once and are ready to fire him. It's a tool to say, is there something here going wrong? Is this turned into a problem? Patrick's going to have a bad day. Let me call him, pick up the phone, say what's going on. Oh, he got frustrated because he lost this particular sale, and he was really enthusiastic about it. Let him refresh his batteries, and then he'll get back on his game. Uh, or is there something worse going on? Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I'm distracted. I'm going through a divorce. Yeah, there's a lot of ways that seeing these deviations from that baseline are used in a positive way. We actually, it's one of the greatest stories that we get to share when we hear from our customers when they say, yeah, we thought we had someone who was possibly going out the door or doing something. His behavior was showing that he was heading in the wrong direction. Turns out he was having a bad situation at home, and we called him in HR. They said, look, we've got these services through our healthcare. Why don't you take some time and spend with them? And they use the tool to, number one, identify there was a problem, because they may not have known. Some people just don't like to talk about that, and then offer some helpful assistance to that employee. So there's tons of positive aspects to how this technology is used. The fact that I might deviate today from my baseline, I have not yet met a single customer who said that would be grounds for, all right, all hands alert, Patrick's not performing today. No, it might be, oh, Patrick's not, maybe I should go say hi, just see how he's doing. Maybe he's had a bad day. If I've been off all week or 2 weeks, that's a bigger issue. Maybe a deeper discussion is involved. So again, I love the positive aspect to how seeing these deviations can be turned into, let's help that employee.
No, I love that. And by the way, I love the fact that you're picking on yourself, that you're the guy that has to be monitored. You're not picking on me. So that's good, because I always
I'm
thought
very
you were
high
kind of,
risk.
yeah, you are very high risk, which is a whole other topic as well. So we've got like 23 minutes left. I want to make sure we have enough time to get through all this. Let's keep plugging away. The second one I've got here, and how you should measure, is thinking about how long to measure. And the reason for this is, as you're determining a baseline or building a baseline, you've got to figure out both how long you're going to measure for the baseline, as well as how long you really want to be watching that employee. Patrick gave a couple of good examples of how things change, and in essence, he was even saying there was a shift in his own life in this scenario, this sort of totally made up fictitious scenario, right, Patrick? Wink, wink.
Precisely.
No, teasing you. And so you've got to figure out how long should you be watching all the time. I mean, there's even I've got some commentary coming back from some of the audience, asking about this issue of like going back to Sophia's comment about, this could tank employee satisfaction with the company and things like that. Should you be big brothering people all the time? There's some questions here. Sophia's talking about maybe invasion of privacy. Tiffany, you're asking about, do we have to tell employees are being monitored? We'll address all those questions. Yeah, as in a moment here, we're kind of talking about all this stuff here, but you've got to figure out how long you should be measuring for each person. And then let me do this, Patrick. I'm just going to hit the last three, and then let's talk about them all together. And set up some kind of alerting or some ability to monitor. Teresa actually asked, said that should the information be managed maybe by HR? And in some cases, that really does kind of make sense. There's only really probably two people that are going to be notified. It's either their boss or it's HR, and then they decide what they want to do about it. That kind of thing. And that way they can be looking at this for from a team standpoint, to Patrick's earlier comment. And then you've got to have some kind of response plan. So, and part of this response plan isn't just okay, we're going to bring the employee in, we're going to sit them down, we're going to tell them we know that they've been screwing off on Facebook. There's a culture issue here. You have to be very sensitive to how you're going to do this, because you don't, to Sophia's earlier point, you don't want to just go and piss off the entirety of all your employees thinking that they're being monitored. You may not want them to be monitored. To go back to Tiffany, you had asked, are employers obligated to tell employees they're being monitored? I will answer the question, and Patrick, I'd actually ask you to answer the question as well, but I'm going to preface, we aren't attorneys. We don't play one on TV. You should definitely go seek your own legal counsel before you start doing employee monitoring for your own local, county, city, state, country laws, all that kind of stuff. But in general, I can speak to at least like the U.S. as an example. As a general statement, not a blanket statement for all of the U.S., but a general statement. In most places in the U.S., the employees have no reasonable expectation of privacy in the workplace. The recommendation is always to, at least in like an acceptable use policy, maybe in a confidential information and intellectual property agreement, a SEPA agreement, things like that, you tell them that they have no reasonable expectation of privacy, that their actions may be monitored. You don't tell them how, don't tell them where, but you do tell them that it's there. That way, at least the company is, to Patrick's statement a couple minutes ago about, at least you're setting the expectation for the employee. But again, kind of putting this all together back to the response plan, you got to think about this from a cultural standpoint of how you're going to address this. And you may not want to actually let employees know specifically how you know that they've been screwing off, because then you go, they're watching us on our computers, and then you go right down that negative path. And then the last part here is then you've got to think about what tools are necessary to facilitate all of this. Into our commentary that we had on that last slide here, Patrick, thoughts on all this real quick?
Yeah, I'll try to unpack this as quickly as I can. Number one, again, it's my philosophy, and we stress this here at Veriato, is that start with a policy by informing your employees what the expectations are. We operate in over 100 countries. There are a variety of legal jurisdictions, legal legislations that any employer must observe before doing this. But I have even seen in some areas that have probably some of the most stringent privacy regulations and legislation, there's always still caveats for the ability of employers to monitor for fraud. So just check with your legal representation on how best to do it in your jurisdiction. I have not seen a jurisdiction yet, at least in the countries that we operate in, where it's outlawed. Clearly we wouldn't be operating there if it was. But you need to observe your jurisdiction that you're in, and especially if you're operating internationally, you might have employees deployed overseas and that sort of thing. So there's an answer, and our technology will help support that. But it's not. I would always start with setting the expectations with the employee. That look, you even said yourself, you were speaking sort of in the voice of the employee, that they're monitoring our computers. Well, if the employer has provided the computer, it's technically the employer's computer. So that culture needs to be, and that distinction needs to be made clearly by the employer. Look, this is our data. You're being paid to improve here or to add to our revenue or whatever your job is. So you're doing all this on behalf of them. They have a right to understand if it's walking out the doors or if they're paying someone to do nothing. So as long as we understand that up front, then we've opened up the discussion for the rest of this. How long to measure? That's probably going to be determined on what you feel your needs are. Most employers that deploy our stuff, well, I don't know most. Let me retract that for a moment. Some of our customers have short-term issues. Some have longer-term issues. They'll leave it running perpetually. The way that our behavior analytics works is that they expect that a human being is going to evolve slowly over time. I should be getting better, maturing, improving my productivity, maybe modifying what technologies I'm using over time. So those behaviors would be measured, and if you graphed them, it would probably look more like a curve over time. But if I've changed drastically over the last month or so, then that might signal that there's something different going on. It just might need a different investigation to see if this is a cause for alert. And speaking of alerting, so setting up alerting, there are specific things that may be under any circumstances unwanted. Enterprise, while an employee checking their Facebook account a few minutes a day may not be a huge infringement, but if they're using their Facebook account and sending violent messages, then or maybe viewing content that's inappropriate for work, then there's clearly issues here that I don't care how productive the employee typically might be. Those are red flags for any enterprise, because enterprises will often become liable, and then in some cases maybe even obligated, depending on the legal jurisdiction they operate in, to notify law enforcement. And so therein, I think one of the comments I'd seen was, do you need to notify employees that they're being monitored? Well, again, that's reliant on the jurisdiction you're in, on what notification and how that must be done. We provide, our technology provides a multitude of ways to do that, but we also have customers who have to work with law enforcement, and law enforcement would say, do not tip off the employee because it might interrupt now our investigation. So you've used your technology to let us know there's a significant issue, but now it's in the hands of law enforcement. So there's so many different contexts to how to answer some of these questions. But the bottom line is you need to understand the jurisdictions you operate in and the needs of your organization and what's the situation if you do have an alert.
The other aspect of this, I think, is most organizations are not going to be doing this probably in a way where it's we're just going to kind of see who's not doing their work and who's not productive, and we're going to gently talk to them and those kinds of things. This is something that's more probably seen as, and it's seen as a threat to the organization. Sophia commented that I actually portrayed employers as one of benign oversight. I didn't mean that. And if it came across that way, that's not the point. I'm trying to encourage people to do things right. Don't piss off the employee. That's a bad thing. But at the same time, most of the time I spend my world in thinking about security and thinking about insider threats. And so if, for example, if you were going to set up an insider threat program, you'd be trying to assess levels of risk for each employee and then put appropriate monitoring on them. In some cases, none. In some cases, maybe just behavior analytics for maybe leading indicators, and for some, maybe user activity monitoring for really detailed what are they doing all day long. And in the same kind of vein, an organization might want to look at productivity in the same light, saying, all right, well, let's figure out where is our risk. And that's probably dictated more by what role they play, and if they are screwing around and not working, it actually costs the organization more than somebody who is, I don't know, in the mailroom or something. I'm not trying to belittle someone's job, but I just mean something that doesn't have, let's say if there's you're in a financial institution and you're managing accounts that are worth millions of dollars and they want you productive versus the person in the mailroom. There's a very big difference to the organization. And so you look at that from a risk standpoint, and then that's what determines basically all these steps and how these steps are addressed and to what degree and what intensity and so on. And so on the topic of sort of insider threats, we've been talking a lot about productivity. We should talk a little bit more about some of the other issues. Patrick and I both kind of touched them a little bit. He mentioned things like some HR issues. You might see an employee that you find that when they're being productive, they're always in their web browser. Well, what are they doing in their web browser? If you have enough detail, maybe you got user activity monitoring or something, you're seeing that they're actually on a job site looking for jobs constantly. Well, now you can figure pretty much they're thinking about leaving. Certainly true insider threats. I'm thinking about malicious insider threats when I wrote this bullet. So I had a couple of examples here of like fraud or data theft. You could, of course, have just a negligent, unwitting type of insider threats where they're participating in. They clicked on a piece of malware, and now you've got an external. That's actually, I think I've got that on here. I do have that on here. That's right. Unwitting insiders. The remote people can obviously be sucked into some different kinds of scams, and a couple that I've been reading about lately. So one, for example, where scammers actually did a phishing attack on people that were involved in mortgage closings. So brokers, the lenders, the title insurance company, and they would tell them that their password on their cloud-based system needed to be reset. And they did the traditional thing where like you kind of reset it, and they reset it behind the scenes, but they do it so they can just watch, they can log in as the person and see what kinds of closings are happening. And then they find out that Patrick is closing on a house on Friday, and he's going to have to deposit $300,000. And then what they do is they send Patrick a spoofed email from somebody in the closing. They got all that detail by snooping around inside the application. And they say, hey, Patrick, well, sorry for the last minute notice here. We had to change what bank it's going to. Could you use this routing number and this account number instead? And then Patrick goes, okay. And then he sends his 300 grand right to the bad guys, and they suck it out, and it's gone. And Patrick loses his house, loses his money. There's no closing, and the scammers are gone. So unwitting insiders is also kind of a big issue here, particularly because cloud-based applications are used. So it's very easy for someone to purport to be that cloud-based application and basically compromise a password, that kind of thing. Patrick, what else did I miss here?
Well, there's an endless number of scenarios that could happen. I want to touch on a couple of these already, because these are some of the more common ones. Why is an employee who might be considering leaving a risk, or what's the problem? why should the employer be concerned? Well, it could be a couple of things. Number one, a lot of employees tend to walk out the doors from past employers with anything they created under their belt. They stick it in their pocket, they put it on a flash stick, they copy it to Git, or to their Git repo, or GitHub, or whatever. And it's that what's mine is mine mentality. But also, let's turn that on its head. Let's say, what if they haven't been happy with their relationship with their manager or the company, or something else is going on. Understanding that an employee is leaving, what if they're a good employee? Maybe I should reach out to them and say, look, if you're thinking about leaving, let's understand the issues. If it's something we can improve, I'd rather keep you than lose you. So there are a lot of things here that just because someone's leaving, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, or that it's a bad thing that the employer knows it. Maybe it gives the employer an opportunity to step in and say, before you consider, what if we talked about changing your work schedule, or giving you more face time, or changing the project you're on. So there are a lot of remedies to some of these issues that don't always have to go straight to the typical view that I think people have of employers using this technology. There's so much good that can be brought out of it as well. Insider threats. Now, this is the true negative. Employers are going to want to know if the employee is doing something that's going to potentially damage the company. If you're in accounting, could you be siphoning off funds and sticking them in your Bitcoin account or whatever? Or if you work on the engineering team, are you sending the source code to third parties? There was a headline recently with Tesla, I believe, on something similar to this. So there are real world cases where the employee could be doing something and the employer would never know without some sort of technology to alert them that this is a potential issue here. Maybe they had permission to upload their code to GitHub, but if they didn't, the employer now knows and can figure out how to remediate that. Unwitting insiders. This is a huge topic, because this just means typically human beings and our ability to be fooled easily. It doesn't matter how senior you are, doesn't matter how educated you are, doesn't matter whether you're remote or in the company headquarters. Human beings are typically the number one vector for any successful malware campaign, and for most successful intrusions where data theft occurs. It's because someone, I had a situation, I'll tell you right now, recently I had a fake email go to my personal email account from LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I try to babysit that account in great detail as much as I can. And it was one of these typical, you've had X number of views or whatever this past week. And I typically ignore them. This particular time I decided, let me go do my analytics and see if anything interesting pops up. I'm a little self-centered that way. It looked identical to every other email I've ever gotten. It displayed as coming from LinkedIn in my email client, and everything about the email looked legitimate. And when I clicked on the click here to go to look at your analytics, it spun me off to a series of redirects, and then ended up wanting to tell me my computer was infected. One of these fake windows that similar to what we call ransomware these days. I was fooled. And I like to consider myself a very smart person. I've been in computer security for over 20 years. I've seen just about every kind of attack and every vector you can imagine, and yet I'm a human being. And I was an unwitting insider at that point. Technically, it happened at home, but it didn't matter because I used my LinkedIn account at work as well. It's part of my job flow during the day. It is expected, but had I been in my work environment, I could have potentially risked having an infected system. And if it was ransomware, potentially could have spread. So that unwitting insider thing is a huge gap for any organization. And the reason I focus on that for a moment is because we actually have a great use case from one of our customers who did have a ransomware infection. And there was an article online, they said publicly they used Veriato 360 and were able to trace how that ransomware got into their network due to the monitoring that was going on. So it actually sort of unwittingly turned into a investigative tool for incident response as well. In that regard, it wasn't due to the employer doing something in particular or intentionally. It was just an accidental. They clicked on something that they thought was legitimate, and it brought risk to the network, to the organization. So a lot to digest here, and yes, there are tons of other scenarios that where a technology like what Veriato provides can help in any organization, regardless of the industry.
Good stuff. Let's do this. We got 5 minutes left. If you guys have got questions, stick those in the Q&A box. Be happy to answer those as much as we can. I've got just a quick slide. Patrick, let me just sum things up. That's all I'm going to do in this last slide. And then because I know you don't have any really pitch slides, maybe after I'm done summing this up, if you can give the audience just a quick overview of Veriato and the solutions that they have and what they can offer here. We've done a little bit of peppering in throughout the conversation today, but I think it'd be good for them to at least know. So let me kind of sum this up for you guys here. Focusing mostly on the productive side, I think today that's where most of the conversation was revolving around here. You can kind of walk through these bullets and just, again, kind of overview of what we've talked about today. You want to be thinking about employee engagement in a way to make sure that keeping them productive as well, and employees being remote does put the organization at risk. And in some cases, that risk shifts. Don't forget that just because you trust somebody when you hire them doesn't mean that they can't suddenly be deep in debt a year later or feel like they've gotten passed up and on promotions and things like that, and now they're due something, or they get another job offer and they want to take information with them, or whatever the case is. That anyone being remote, I put here tangible costs. What I mean by there is really more tangible risk for the organization here. The measurement of activity, whether it's the productivity or whether it's security focused, it's all very tactical. It really does come down to things like we talked about on the productivity side. How often are they in an application? Is it actively being used or just in the background? If it's more security focused, it would be things like how often are they printing? How often are they copying files? What websites are they going to? It's very tactical types of ways that you can measure. And then using things like behavior analytics, you can start to see trends of whether that's normal for the user or not. And then you can get leading indicators of if there's a real concern around productivity or security. And then this last bullet here is just kind of things we talked about in the last slide. Be mindful that it's not just productivity, but there are, just by the mere nature of you watching employees, you're going to have the ability to see HR issues that come up, maybe even we haven't even talked about harassment yet. That's another topic that's totally not even discussed today. You could come across someone harassing another employee if you have tools in place that are tactically watching activity and so on, as well as security issues, seeing what employees are doing that might be not in the company's best interest. So with that, again, audience, if you got questions, stick them in the Q&A box. We still have a couple minutes left. And then, Patrick, would you give the audience just a quick overview of Veriato and their solutions?
Absolutely, and I really want to thank you for doing this today. A couple of these slides we could easily have spent an entire hour on alone. This is such a rich discussion, and I'm sure after this is over, I'm going to regret all the things I forgot to say. But that just speaks to the depth of this topic. And so if folks are interested to learn more, please reach out to Veriato.com. We'd be more than happy to have these discussions and discuss what your situation is or what concerns you. Veriato, I'm going to do a quick plug. We've been doing user activity monitoring for over 20 years. We're based here in South Florida. Our flagship technology does user activity monitoring as well as user and entity behavior analytics. It is suitable for the largest of enterprises all the way down to small, medium-sized business, and it's designed to meet the needs and concerns for regardless what your size is, regardless what your industry is. And it's something that I've been very excited to do for this past year, having spent, nearly 20 years in commercial security at the endpoint, packet filtering, network intrusion, antivirus, and even national security before then. So this has been a really great addition to my personal portfolio. It's been a journey that I've really enjoyed because I really see the value of this. I see so many industries going this direction. 20 years ago, when the internet was a kind of a newer thing, organizations were just learning how to do business online. Now they're seeing the risk day after day in the headlines over what happens when there's a breach, and so time after time the breach is also attributed to something that someone inside their network did, either on purpose or even by accident. So I see this area growing. I see it very exciting, and so I just want to thank the listeners. Please give us a call. Go to our website again at Veriato.com and learn more, and give us a call if we can help you. This is our specialty.
Perfect. So we're at the top of the hour, but I know we've got a $250 Amazon gift card we're supposed to give away, and so we'll do that real quick. And it looks like there's maybe 2 questions. So what I'm doing is I'm going to give away the gift card, and if you guys need to bail, you can feel free to bail. And then in the other case, we'll answer the question or 2 that are still in the Q&A box after that if you want to hang on and sit tight. So the winner of the Amazon gift card is Werner Lanau. Werner, I hope I said your last name right. I hope I didn't murder it. But you've won the $250 Amazon gift card, so congratulations. And then real quick, actually looks like one of the questions is from Dave. He's asking about the slides. Will those be made available after the presentation? I believe so. I don't have the marketing folks from Steve Smith says, "Bugger, I never win." But to Dave, to answer your question, I don't have the marketing folks from Veriato on the call, but I believe that they'll be able to have those available to you as well. So if not, try and reach out to me via email and I'll get you a copy of the slides if they don't do it themselves. Justin is asking, this is I think more for you, Patrick. He's saying, what solutions do you offer for remote desktop monitoring?
Well, our technology will monitor, number one, that users are using remote desktop, and as long as the endpoint that is being remoted to has our client on it, it itself is being monitored. So it goes either way, whether you're remoting in from a system. The fact that you're using remote desktop on a monitor from a monitored system can be recorded. And number 2, you want the client on the system that they're remoting to if you own that asset. Now, if they're remoting to something that's outside your control, then that itself would be its own alert, because obviously you wouldn't be wanting your employees remoting to other systems unless they're in a support situation, and that's a totally different discussion as far as configuration. But we kind of support all of those scenarios.
All right. So Justin's asking a follow-up question: does that include terminal servers?
We do have terminal server support.
Okay, good. Steve says, great talk, by the way, great stuff. He's the guy that said, "Bugger, he never wins." He said, do you find that remote workers are a greater security risk, or do you find productivity is the greatest concern? And let me address this a little bit here. A lot of times the risk really is determined based on the individual's role in the organization and what information they have access to. From a security standpoint, the productivity standpoint is probably gauged more along the lines of what's that person's time worth to the organization, and therefore is it worthwhile you trying to keep tabs on them. I would prefer that organizations focus on probably everything as a threat to the organization, and you determine whether or not productivity you consider a threat or not. And if you do, then treat it the same way you would any other threat and just look based on the role in the organization. But Patrick, what's your thoughts?
No, I agree. You need to assess what is the situation, what is the mission of your company, what is the role of the employee. In an engineering role, it may look totally different than someone in a sales role. So where's the risk? The risk often can just, we're all humans, so the human aspect can always come to play. I could be the most productive employee for years, and then if I hit, some downturn in my personal life, financial, relational, whatever, that can change on a dime. We're human beings. Sometimes it's salvageable, sometimes it's not. Sometimes employees can really be so disgruntled that they go down a path that there's no return. It varies so much, but having a tool to give you a heads up, hey, there's an issue here, you need to know, because it could be a huge risk to the organization, to your data, to your intellectual property, to the private information. We didn't really talk much about healthcare and health organizations or even financial organizations, but all that information is gathered in terabytes now at scales that we've never seen before, and organizations are under greater pressure to make sure that access to that information is controlled, that people who are accessing it are doing the right thing with it. And so the risks are enormous for organizations these days. Because of all the online risks and online threats, as well as internal threats. So if you look at that and think about that for a moment, I think you'll see no question of why more and more organizations are looking to technologies like ours to help them, because there's no way they can monitor thousands of employees or whatever with the volume of private information or intellectual property they may have in their possession.
Cool. Then we're going to take one more because we're 4 minutes past the hour. I appreciate you guys staying on. Again, if you have to drop, we totally understand. We're just trying to get all the questions done that we can here. Dave is asking, saying, how do you ensure remote employees are the correct person? And my first answer was going to be two-factor authentication. Then Dave said, do you recommend, as a separate question, two-factor authentication for worker identification? And my answer is sort of twofold. And I think, Patrick, you're going to agree with me violently on this one. One is two-factor authentication so that you have at least some kind of measure in place where the employee has something they know, something they have. But even two-factor authentication, even with cell phones, mobile devices, with getting like a text to to validate you with a code and all that, even that's already been broken on a number of cases over and over again. So that can't be the only thing. And more so, I think, from a technology standpoint of in a longer period of time, like let's say a user actually succumbs to being fooled like Patrick was, and an external hacker actually gets control and compromises their endpoint and now is acting under their user account. Okay, so now it's technically quote unquote the user, right? It's the same person who logged on, but it's not because they're being remote controlled with a rat using a remote access Trojan of some kind. And so that's where something like user behavior analytics comes in play, because now suddenly the behaviors of the user look different over a period of time. And I'm not talking about just behavior from, let's say, like an endpoint detection solution that's watching to see which processes open, which other processes, and that sort of thing. I'm talking about overall, like, wow, they never copy files to the cloud or send emails of that attachment size before, so why are they doing that now? I mean, those really specific kinds of actions that would indicate that might not actually be the same person. So, Patrick, you agree? Kind of those two ways to ensure it's the actual individual that owns the account?
It is. Our technology is based on the user account, and obviously, if that user's behaviors change significantly, that's an issue. Or if there's specific alerts or specific access issues that trigger alerts, that would potentially go to, depending on the scenario, either HR or your security team. So the remote access tool scenario would definitely trigger an incident, and if our technology is the one that alerts to that first, then it becomes part of that investigation. And it's not, it doesn't mean that the employee did something wrong, but it gives the employer a tool to be able to say, okay, I know this impacted Patrick's account. Let me see if any other users had similar activity. Maybe their accounts were also affected. And so it becomes an incident response tool in that regard as well.
Love it. With that, we're again 7 minutes past the hour. You guys that stayed on, there's still almost like a good 2/3 of you that were joined us. They're still on. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for staying with us. Patrick, thanks for a good conversation today.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Yep, and for you guys in the audience, we hope this was enjoyable, educational. Obviously we had a fair amount of engagement on your part, so we really appreciate that as well. And so thanks for attending, and we'll catch you on the next webcast.